Hey guys! So today you and I are going to talk about mastering a programming language. So let's get into it. So the question in question was, hi Frederick, must one master all facets of a programming language before one can be considered an expert in that language? Well, that is up for interpretation, I would say. So according to me, no, I would say not, because I apply more or less the same mentality to my programming language as I do for a native language. I have been born and raised in my country, and I know how to speak, in this case, Swedish. I've spoken, it's my native language, but I'm far from an expert on it. So, am I a master of the language? It's up to you. Is native speech or being a native speaker the same thing as mastering, mastership, right? And I argue it's the same thing for software development and programming languages and stuff like that. What I usually like to say is that you have, in my opinion at the very least, mastered a language when you know all the nuances of the language. So in other words, when you have reached a point where the basic syntax and like you can express what you have in your mind. So what I usually say is that the first goal, the first true indicator of seniority, in my opinion, is when you reach a point where the programming language is just a formality. It doesn't really affect you much. And the reason what I mean by that is that practically, at least most of them, not all of them, but a lot of programming languages are extremely similar. So if you know how to do something in Python and the various construct you can use in Python, it's very likely that you will find the same sort of construct in another language. That's, I don't know, just pick one, JavaScript or so forth, or Java and C Sharp. Like those are like ridiculously close in terms of similarities and so forth. But most of the constructs are there, and so what I argue is like real programming is when you understand those like mental tools like a loop, variables, how to objects and constructs and methods and functions and like all of these different, which are in essence not necessarily strictly tied into a specific programming language. It's just different programming languages have, as I said, different ways of solving various problems, and they have other things on top. Like those basics, that core, is almost always the same. And so, to be a true senior, I argue, you should be able to pick up basically any language. You don't have to know every nuance of it, but you should be able to programming in it. And that is, to me, what true seniority. It's the without that, like I argue that then no, you're not a real, in my opinion, senior. I think it's Bjarne Strostrup, if I don't pronounce pronouncing his name correctly, the guy behind C++, who said something. I think I watched a tech talk where he's claimed that to be quote unquote a professional software developer, you should know at least five languages. That's his opinion. And to me, like I don't go that far. I'm saying that that is to me the state I'm talking about, where if I tell you, if I take a job today, guys, I feel 100% certain that if you give me a stack that I've never touched before, like a language, like because there are languages I've never worked in, I feel very confident in that I will be able to be productive in that in a lot less than a junior software developer who has only worked in that, for example, because I've programmed in so many different languages and spent so much time in the industry that I sort of know what I need before I even like. I mean, that's how you get a sixth sense for like what a good solution looks like and a bad solution looks like. Because if you know that in 3, 4, 5 languages you have the basic same construct, or I mean, I don't have to go and check the documentation to know that there is certain utility functions and stuff like that in practically every language. It's because the need is the same, and the only thing I have to look up is that specific name of like the thing, like how do I actually create that thing, but I know that it is in the language. That's the thing that usually takes time, and that's where I argue real mastership starts happening. Mastership to me is when you understand the nuance, which is higher than what I'm talking about now. So to give you a very concrete example, like I know how to program in quite a lot of languages. But if we take, say, JavaScript as one of the languages, it doesn't have to be JavaScript, there are a few other languages. In JavaScript, I've spent so much time that I know that even though I can do these things, like I could basically copy paste everything I know how to do in, say, Java, and more or less recreate it in JavaScript. That's not true mastership. It is seniority because I can make it work and it's going to be decent code and stuff like that. But I've learned that ecosystem well enough to know that there are certain flavors that are specific to that language that may not be a direct translation into another stack. So in Java, for example, you have a lot of object-oriented programming, and although you do have classes and you have these concepts in JavaScript, the JavaScript community and how we do things in JavaScript is much more in like a I'm not saying functional way, but it is not as strictly object-oriented as, say, in Java, which means that I sort of understand that there are a few flavors of how to do things in JavaScript that might work better in that specific ecosystem than it will work in, say, Java. Because if I do the same thing in Java, because I could start trying to do a lot of this, follow the same basic patterns of work that JavaScript has, and pull that over to Java, but it's going to feel a little bit weird to people who are working in Java, because there are, as I said, nuances like norms, patterns of like recognizable patterns and conventions and all of this sort of stuff. When you know that stuff in a language, then I argue that you've reached true mastership. That's the level I would say. And that doesn't mean that you know every single method of the thing. It's just that you know how to write code in that language so it feels very natural, intuitive to people who only know that language, and you avoid these common pitfalls that every language has. I mean, take JavaScript as an example. I say the same thing about C, for example. I hope the C programmers can back me up on this one. C and JavaScript and so forth, the people who transition into those and from another language, they might have certain ways of doing things and so forth, but because those languages are usually a little bit looser and like there's a lot of ways, Scala is a little bit the same way in my opinion, there's a lot of ways of doing things, and if you're not careful, you're going to trip yourself up pretty badly, and you have reached true mastership of that language when you've learned through pain usually what's going to work and what's not going to work, because you can usually do the same things in many different ways. It's just that you now know of the quote-unquote best way, or the path of least resistance to structure things that you are writing in that specific language. But you also know that that way of doing things may not necessarily be a good direct translation in how you would do it in another language. So what I want you to take away from this is that no, I wouldn't say that you need to learn everything about a programming language before you're an expert or master or whatever. I would say that you're an expert in a language when you have learned the nuances of that language and the overall way that the community usually does things and so forth and so forth. And that's going to happen way before you master every facet of it. Like, guys, I have worked in JavaScript for example now for many years, and I'm never going to go as far as to claim that I've learned all the interfaces or the syntax or all the new, as I said, even all the different ways you can do things or so forth. And there are patterns that I still will never use in that language. Same thing with Java. Same thing with C# these days, and so forth and so forth. And that's sort of my point. Like, I'm not necessarily, I don't need to be an expert of a programming language to be able to be called a senior or to be able to produce working software that most people will get behind and say, yeah, this is going to work, it's going to fill the requirements and so forth. But I argue that once you have learned, like, 'cause some languages are more forgiving to people who are not true experts of them. As I said, my favorite example of that would be languages, say Java and C#. These languages are very, in my opinion, very well made in terms of how easy it is to usually get things right in terms of just when you write code and so forth. There are, of course, a lot of weirdnesses, and which every language has it. This is not exclusive to any of those languages, but I've always found that it's sort of the argument I make for why you use frameworks and stuff like that. Certain ecosystems, certain frameworks and so forth, they are designed well enough that it makes it easier for someone who is not a complete super genius master of the language to get pretty good results. And then there are languages and frameworks and so forth that put a lot more more on you. You sort of have to really know what you're doing in order to get really the same sort of result. I argue that languages such as, say, C and JavaScript are probably those languages, and I usually tell people who give JavaScript a hard time that the reason why you might have issues with it is, in my opinion, not so much with the language. It is just that that language is perhaps not as well designed, or call it whatever you want. It requires more of you. You have to have an understanding of the nuances of that language to a greater extent to make it work for you. But if you know that, if you are a real expert of it, it's like, to me, it's like I never have any problem with JavaScript. Never, 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 ever, ever, ever. And that is because I argue that I've reached that point where I understand the nuances of the language. I understand a lot of its quirks and like what is a good, what a good thing is and what a bad thing is in that specific language. But you don't have to go that far to be a senior, because if you just know how, like, the core stuff, like how you like structure abstractions, object and programming and stuff like that, if you know you're really good at that stuff, and you can measure if you really know that stuff by trying to transition between languages. If it takes you if it's not that big of a hurdle for you to jump from one language to another, that is basically like, some languages are very different, but a lot of them are very, very similar. If you can make those switches without a lot of effort on your part, then you have reached true seniority. And you don't necessarily have to be a master of a language to be productive in it. Have a great day.